The rain fell in fine, slanted lines as the train hissed into the quiet station of Greystone Hollow, its whistle low and mournful beneath the heavy sky. Hercule Poirot, dressed impeccably in charcoal gray, stepped onto the damp platform with the precision of a man accustomed to reading more from silence than speech. The landscape around him was bleak. Moorland stretched to the horizon, dark hedgerows twisted by time and wind, and a cold wind curled low to the earth like something hunting. A coach awaited, its driver silent, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They did not speak during the slow, rattling journey. The road narrowed into a serpentine path lined with skeletal trees, until finally the silhouette of Greystone Abbey rose before them, tall, gray, and broken along its edges like a cathedral abandoned mid-repentance. It had once been a monastery, then a sanatorium, and now a crumbling ancestral manor that seemed caught between centuries. Lady Isadora Greystone greeted him at the threshold, her expression carved from stone. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, as if the house itself might overhear. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. My nephew Julian. He was found in the bell tower 2 nights ago. Not dead, but not alive either. He has not spoken a word. No wound. No cause. He just froze." Poirot's eyes narrowed, scanning her pale features, the trembling of her gloved fingers, the way her gaze kept flicking toward the west hallway where the tower stairs climbed into darkness. He didn't ask if she'd already ruled out ghosts. In houses like this, where stories hung like tapestries and footsteps echoed longer than they should, even the most rational minds entertained impossible thoughts. Inside, the hall was dim and cold, its chandeliers unlit, the furniture solemn in their arrangement. Paintings of long-dead ancestors watched from every wall, their eyes following with the unblinking patience of judgment. Poirot glanced upward at the curving staircase, and somewhere far above, a bell that hadn't rung in decades let out a faint metallic groan, as if awakened. And yet, Poirot said nothing. He simply adjusted his gloves, and with a tone as calm as still water said, "Take me to the room, the one where he was found." What he did not say, what he already suspected, was that this case would not be solved by footprints or fingerprints. It would require listening to the silence, to the house itself, and to the stories it had tried so hard to bury. The bell tower of Greystone Abbey stood like a sentinel above the moors, its stones blackened with age, its interior hollow and echoing. When Poirot ascended the winding stairs the following morning, mist still clung to the narrow windows, and the scent of damp mortar filled the air. Lady Isadora remained below. She had said she could not bear to go up again. Julian Greystone's condition, Poirot had learned from the doctor, was not medical. His pulse had been steady, his lungs strong. He bore no bruises, no head trauma, no sign of seizure or stroke. Yet he had been found sitting cross-legged at the base of the bell, eyes open and unblinking, his lips parted as if frozen mid-confession. His fingernails were caked with dust. He had not responded to voices or light or touch. Only now, days later, did he whisper in fractured phrases, disconnected, like fragments of a shattered mind. Poirot examined the tower with surgical precision. A spent candle near the north wall. A chair dragged a foot from its usual resting place. Dust disturbed in small patterns, not footprints, but perhaps knees. He spotted something tucked beneath a loose stone by the wall, a sliver of parchment, stained and brittle. It bore a single Latin phrase scrawled in faded ink, "Et vos mortuorum audietis," and the voice of the dead you shall hear. Poirot tucked it into his pocket carefully. Back inside the manor, he turned his attention to the inhabitants of Greystone. The family was small, reclusive. Aside from Lady Isadora and Julian, there was Celeste, Julian's sister. She was quiet, pale, with wide eyes that always seemed to fix on something just behind a person. Her presence felt like a question left unanswered. Celeste was seated in the library when Poirot approached. She was reading, or pretending to. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. "Your brother," Poirot began gently, "was researching something, was he not?" Her lips parted, but her answer took time. He said the house was waking up, that something was moving through the walls again. Poirot did not smile. "And what did you believe, mademoiselle?" "I believed," she whispered. That he was right. He looked around. The library was massive, its shelves bowed with weight. Above the fireplace hung a faded portrait of a monk, hooded and gaunt. His hands were outstretched, as if pleading or warning. Poirot noticed another figure hovering near the threshold, Mrs. Elwood, the housekeeper. A woman of strict posture and even stricter silence. She said little unless addressed directly. Poirot turned to her now. "Madame Elwood, may I ask, has anyone else spoken of hearing voices?" Echoes in the halls. The woman hesitated. Her composure cracked just slightly. "This house," she said carefully, "has always had its sounds." Poirot nodded once. He was not chasing ghosts. He was chasing patterns. And in old houses, patterns were the bones of every secret. That evening, as the fog thickened and the last of the candles flickered in the hallways, Poirot stood once more at the base of the tower. Somewhere far above, the bell swayed gently, though there was no wind. The voices of the dead, indeed. But Poirot did not believe in spirits, only in people, and the terrible things they do when they believe no one is watching. The morning crept into Greystone Abbey like a ghost unwilling to cross the threshold. Light filtered through stained glass in broken hues of crimson and amber, painting the stone floors of the ancient chapel in silent fragments of something once sacred. Poirot stood beneath the arch of the transept, his hands folded behind his back, observing not the altar, but the man kneeling quietly before it. He had seen the young curate, Father Marrow, once before, at dinner, speaking little, his eyes downcast, his presence gentle. Now, beneath the flickering glow of votive candles, the man appeared almost incorporeal, as though shaped from mist and memory. Poirot did not disturb him at first. There was a ritual in solitude, and a language in silence. At last, when the curate rose, Poirot approached with his trademark softness. "Forgive me, mon père," he said, "but I find myself drawn to this place. There is something in the air, something not quite restful." Marrow's smile was faint. "It hasn't been restful for years." "You speak not of the spiritual," Poirot observed. The curate shook his head slowly. "This house has old wounds. The family buries them beneath bloodlines and decorum, but you can still hear them if you listen closely." Poirot's eyes narrowed just slightly. "The voice of Brother Armand?" Marrow turned to him fully. "You've heard of the legend." "I have heard many things. That Brother Armand was accused of heresy, that he was sealed alive beneath this abbey, that on fog-heavy nights he sings." Marrow's face did not move. "I don't believe in ghosts, monsieur, but I do believe in guilt, in memory, and in what they can do to a mind left too long in silence." Poirot inclined his head, acknowledging the weight of the statement. As the day unfolded, Poirot resumed his exploration of the house, this time with permission to search the unused west wing. Long abandoned, the corridor was covered in a blanket of dust, so thick it seemed to muffle even the air itself. A row of shuttered windows, a broken lantern, and a faint scent, something metallic, something old. Behind a splintered panel in what once may have been a dressing room, Poirot discovered a narrow staircase. It wound down into darkness, stone giving way to soil. With a lamp from the main hall and his gloved hand against the wall, he descended carefully. At the bottom, a small, forgotten crypt. Arched stone ceilings, a broken font, and there, etched crudely into the far wall, the name Armand. Poirot crouched. The floor bore marks not of centuries, but of weeks. Someone had been here. Recently. Candle wax pooled near the alcove, still pliant to touch. A book lay beneath a broken slab, its leather binding worn, its clasp bent. The first page bore no title, just an inscription. "Truth unspoken is the lie that walks." Poirot turned the pages gently. They were filled with handwritten notes, some in Latin, others in English. Prayers, confessions, descriptions of dreams, of bells, of betrayal. One passage stood out. "The voice comes now not from above, but from within. I hear it beneath the skin of this place. I feel it behind the stone." Poirot closed the book and stood. There was no ghost here, but someone wanted one. As he emerged from the crypt and stepped into the chapel once more, the organ let out a single low note, deep, resonant, like breath caught in a lung. He turned. Celeste was seated at the keys. Her fingers rested on the ivory, unmoving, her face unreadable. "I didn't know you played," Poirot said gently. "I don't," she replied, "but sometimes it plays on its own." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, then shifted upward, toward the bell tower above. The ghosts of Greystone, he thought, were not bound by chains or shadows. They moved among the living, and they were listening. A thick fog still cloaked Greystone Abbey by morning, the silence almost deliberate. Poirot noticed the absence of birds near the bell tower. Nature, it seemed, had its own intuition. In the breakfast room, Lady Isidora's facade had thinned. Her composure wavered when she mentioned that Julian had asked for the chapel key the previous night. "I had Harding deliver it. I thought he sought comfort," she said, "but perhaps it was something else." Poirot visited Julian's room again. The young man sat quietly, his hand resting on a book spine. "You've come to ask about the dreams?" Julian said. Poirot nodded gently. "And the mask?" Julian looked startled. "I heard him again last night, near the tower. But when I got there, no one was there. Just the bell moving." Poirot ascended the tower later that day. The climb was steep, the air dense. Beneath the bell, one floorboard creaked differently. He lifted it to find a hidden space, and inside, a black mourning mask. Not a relic, a tool. That evening in the drawing room, Poirot observed the household. Lady Isidora, distant, Celeste touching piano keys without playing, Violet restless at the window, Father Merrow whispering, Harding watching from the shadows. Poirot finally stood. "There is someone here," he said calmly, "who wears fear like a costume, who shapes guilt into performance. Lord Adrian's death wasn't random. It was crafted, like theater, with intent and timing." Eyes shifted. No one spoke. Poirot concluded, "Masks conceal faces, but not truths. And the bell will ring again, this time for justice." The endgame had begun. The fog thickened that evening, as if the Abbey itself wished to keep its secret sealed. Poirot sat in the once sacred library, now more a mausoleum of crumbling books and unread wills than a place of learning. The silence was so complete that he could hear the faint groan of old beams above, with groaning beneath weight or memory, perhaps both. His attention settled on a grand oil portrait hanging above the hearth. Lord Adrian, younger, standing at the edge of the moors, expression defiant. But something felt wrong. Too recent, too careful. Poirot rose, stepped closer, and tilted the frame slightly. Behind it was a gap in the stone, just wide enough to hide a ledger. Inside the recess, he found a small, weathered notebook, bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully. The writing was unmistakably Adrian's. Names, dates, and a recurring phrase inked in sharp strokes, the silencing of Lang. And one final note. What was done beneath this roof will not stay buried. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Percival Lang. The name had surfaced before in medical archives, marginally, dismissed as irrelevant, but now it felt central. Later, he summoned Violet for a walk through the cloister garden. She seemed less fearful tonight, as though something had shifted in her. "My uncle was a man of masks," she said quietly. "He liked to appear noble, but I often heard him pacing at night, whispering to himself. And once, I remember this vividly, I saw him burn a letter. It was addressed to someone called Lang." Poirot didn't respond at first. He stared at the chapel spire, barely visible through the mist. "People do not burn what is harmless, mademoiselle. Only what can shame them." That night, a whisper echoed again in the bell tower, low, rasped, almost rhythmic. Poirot followed the sound alone, climbing each step with caution. At the top, he found nothing but the cold wind swirling in circles. Yet on the windowsill rested a single object, an old key, stained dark. He picked it up delicately and turned toward the stairs. Somewhere below, a door had just creaked open on its own. Or had it been opened? The past, Poirot thought, was no longer knocking. It had found a way in. Morning arrived cloaked in damp silence. The rain had ceased, but the mist clung low to the earth, smothering sound and light. Poirot, dressed with his usual precision, made his way down the east corridor, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the flagstone. In his gloved hand, he carried the old key he had found in the bell tower, its iron teeth worn smooth, its purpose yet unclear. But Poirot believed in symbols, and keys, he knew, always belonged to secrets. He met Lady Agatha in the breakfast room, seated rigidly at the head of the table, untouched toast before her. She looked older this morning, as though the manor's long-held truths had finally begun to erode her composure. "You found something," she said without turning her head. "I have found the whisper behind the silence," Poirot replied gently, "and I must ask to see what lies beyond the cellar door beneath the west wing." She flinched, barely, but enough. "That part of the house is sealed." "Not anymore," Poirot said, placing the rusted key on the tablecloth between them. An hour later, accompanied by Holcomb and the reluctant Lady Agatha, Poirot descended into the lower level of Silvershade Hall. The air turned cold and metallic. The cellar corridor, lined with old wine casks and forgotten crates, ended at a door covered in deep scratches. He inserted the key. The lock resisted, then yielded. Beyond lay a small, windowless chamber. A narrow cot. A desk. Chains. A man had been kept here. Poirot stepped in, studying every inch. A tarnished shaving mirror on the wall. Beneath the cot, a child's book with torn pages. On the desk, a broken quill and remnants of parchment. Ink faded but decipherable. Words like truth, retribution, and Lang. Poirot turned. Percival Lang was imprisoned here, wasn't he? Not treated as a patient, but hidden, silenced. Lady Agatha spoke at last, her voice hollow. Adrian thought it best. Lang was dangerous. He remembered too much. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "No, madam. He was dangerous because he would not forget what was done during the war. The men lost under false orders. Adrian believed burying the truth would protect your family name." Holcomb stepped back from the door, his face pale. "I was told never to speak of it, but I knew someone was down here. I brought food once, when I was younger." Poirot nodded solemnly. It was a silence not born of fear, but of instruction. This house taught you not to question. And so it grew, a rot beneath the floorboards. He left the chamber, letting the door close behind him with a finality that echoed. The past had not only been buried, it had been entombed, kept alive in darkness. And somewhere beyond the moor, Poirot now believed, Percival Lang still walked. Free, forgotten by most, but not by the house, nor by the dead. Truth, Poirot thought, had no expiration, only patience. The fog hung thick over Silvershade Hall that night, swallowing the moors and muffling the sea. At 11:45, Poirot stepped out, lantern in hand, drawn by a figure he'd seen moving for nights. A man half swallowed by mist near the broken orchard wall. The man didn't run. "Mr. Lang," Poirot said quietly. Lang's voice was hoarse. "I came back to ask him why he buried me along with the truth." Poirot answered softly, "Lord Adrian is dead." Lang looked away. He chose silence. "I left the book. I thought he'd read it. Instead, he drank his way out." "You lit the bell," Poirot murmured. "To remind them," Lang said. "Especially Agatha. She always knew." Then he turned and walked into the fog. Poirot did not follow. Some truths don't scream, they echo. And some men, like Lang, carry justice not in their hands, but in their memory. The silence inside Silvershade Hall the following morning was of a different nature. No longer the oppressive hush of secrets, but something weightier, more resigned. Poirot stood alone in the dim chapel, where fractured beams of dawn filtered through the stained glass windows and spilled crimson and violet light across the worn stone floor. In his gloved hand, he held the partially scorched confession from Adrian's journal, one last page that had survived the flames, trembling with the weight of buried guilt. Lady Agatha entered without sound, her presence cold and statuesque. She did not speak at first, merely stood beside Poirot at the altar, where a single candle burned low and steady. The old pews stretched behind them like rows of silent witnesses, empty yet still watching. Poirot's voice, when it came, was low and unhurried. "You knew," he said, not as a challenge, but with quiet certainty. "You suspected all along." Her jaw tightened, though her eyes did not move from the flickering flame. "I suspected," she admitted, her voice dry as parchment. But to know, to speak it aloud, would have meant unraveling everything we were, everything we told ourselves we had preserved. Her fingers trembled faintly. "My brother tried to reveal it, but even then, he did it in half measures." "He feared what would happen if the truth emerged," Poirot replied gently. "But more than that, I think. He feared what it would say about himself, about the man he had become to protect others." She turned to him then, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "He loved us," she said, "but he feared us, too. He feared what silence had turned us into." Poirot nodded once, and in the end he feared himself. A sound from the chapel doors made them both turn. Dr. Fox entered, pale and hollow-eyed, his hands wringing at the edges of his coat. "The constables searched the grounds," he murmured. "There's no sign of Percival Lang. Just footsteps in the moor, and then nothing." His voice caught. He vanished. Poirot looked once more at the altar, at the candle slowly dying in its holder. Then, without a word, he folded the page and slipped it carefully into the inner pocket of his coat. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "justice walks away, and all that remains is what we choose to remember." Outside, as if stirred by something ancient and unseen, the old chapel bell tolled once, though no hand touched the rope. The sound lingered, soft and mournful, before fading into the mist that curled along the edge of the estate. Within the stone walls of Silvershade Hall, the echoes fell still, and the ghosts, at last, grew silent. The fog returned with the evening tide, coiling around Silvershade Hall like a living thing, muffling the sea's voice and casting the estate in ghostly hues of silver and ash. Poirot stood alone on the eastern parapet, gazing toward the moorlands where Percival Lang had disappeared, his footsteps ending where the earth turned soft and swallowed secrets whole. Beneath him, the manor's windows flickered with faint candlelight, casting distorted silhouettes on the glass. Inside, lives were being quietly rearranged, like books placed back on a shelf after a storm. Dr. Fox had resigned that morning. There had been no drama, just a quiet conversation, a brief apology, and the handing over of the last key to the medical records. He left with a suitcase and a bowed head, his past too heavy to be carried forward into a future with witnesses. Violet Danforth was leaving too. She'd stood beside Poirot after breakfast, her eyes no longer clouded, her voice calm as she'd announced her plan to travel to Paris. "There's nothing left for me here, Monsieur Poirot," she'd said, her gaze lingering not on the house, but on the horizon beyond it. Only echoes. Lady Agatha remained, of course. Silvershade was in her blood, perhaps in her bones. She had withdrawn to the north wing, where the windows overlooked the cliff's edge. Meals were now brought to her room. The staff spoke softly in the corridors. There were no new instructions, no harsh reprimands. Just silence, dense, dignified, and unspoken. In her solitude, Poirot suspected, Lady Agatha found not peace, but permanence. She had not tried to justify the past. She had merely decided to survive it. As for Poirot, he moved once more through the chapel before departing. The Book of Silence had been turned to ash, but its message lingered like smoke. He paused before the altar, where he had left a single white feather 3 days ago. It was gone. Whether carried by a breeze or by unseen hands, he could not say, but its absence felt appropriate. The house had spoken, the dead had been heard, and the living had been changed. He exited through the great doors, where the damp wind greeted him like an old acquaintance. The carriage awaited him, its lanterns flickering like watchful eyes in the mist. As Poirot stepped in, he looked once more at Silvershade Hall, its tower rising above the moor like the last note of a solemn hymn. "Justice," he whispered to himself, "is not always an execution. Sometimes it is a silence we choose to keep, and sometimes it is the courage to listen." The wheels turned. The carriage rolled forward into the gray, and the house faded behind him, claimed once more by the mist it had never truly left. Morning came with a hush rather than a blaze, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over Silvershade Hall. Mist still clung to the hedges and the crumbled stonework, like memory, refusing to lift. Poirot sat at the breakfast table in the drawing-room alone, his cup untouched, watching the faint patterns of light shifting on the lace curtains. The silence that had haunted this house for decades now felt changed, less heavy, less accusing, not vanquished, but acknowledged. Julian Danforth, once the ghostly figure at the edge of madness, had been transferred to a sanatorium in Kent, one equipped not with padded cells, but with care. His episodes had grown less severe since the truth came to light. The voices no longer chased him down corridors or echoed from the walls. Instead, they had quieted, as if finally heard. Poirot had visited him the day before, offering no deductions, no final questions. Only a hand on his shoulder and a sentence spoken softly in French. When the soul is given permission to speak, the mind may rest. Back at the manor, the staff resumed their duties with subdued purpose. The bells were silent now, removed from the tower, packed away in velvet-lined crates, as if the house had exhaled the last of its secrets. Mrs. Elwood continued her walks through the eastern corridor each morning, pausing at the chapel door, but never entering. There was no more need to chase shadows. Lady Agatha no longer wore mourning. That morning, she stepped into the parlor in soft gray rather than black. She looked thinner, paler, and yet something in her posture had loosened. She offered Poirot a nod, nothing more, and sat by the fire without speaking. It was the closest either of them would come to farewell. Poirot made his final rounds of the house, with the careful precision of a man closing not just a case, but a chapter of time itself. In the chapel, he paused beside the scorched stone where the book of silence had burned. Nothing remained but faint black soot, no page, no confession, no evidence. And yet everything had changed. Justice had not been swift, but it had arrived. Not with punishment, but with truth. And in that truth, wounds had begun to scar over. As he stepped into the waiting carriage, the sky broke faintly, blue peeking through the cloud, like hope behind grief. The wheels turned slowly, then faster, as Silver Shade faded behind him into the distance. He did not look back. To some, the story of Silver Shade would remain unsolved, a death without a culprit, a bell that rang without touch. But Poirot knew otherwise. There had been no ghost, only guilt dressed in old robes. No madness, only pain misunderstood. No murder, only consequence. And so he returned to the world, where lies still whispered in corridors, and the past still hung from ceilings like dust in unused rooms. But this case, this place, this silence, he would carry with him always. For in the shadows of Silver Shade, he had not merely uncovered truth,